Every empire thinks it's buying an asset. Only later does it realize it signed a pawn ticket. The Suez Canal looks simple on a map, a narrow man-made line slicing through Egyptian desert, joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Just water in a trench, less than 200 kilometers long. But that line has decided the fate of empires, toppled governments, and bailed out bankrupt regimes. Today, a huge share of the world's trade still squeezes through that artificial throat of the global economy. Oil, containers, grain, manufactured goods, all funneled through a space so tight that a single stuck ship can shake global supply chains. We're taught to see it as a triumph of engineering and globalization, a heroic project that brought East and West closer together. But there's another way to read the Suez Canal, a way that doesn't start with bulldozers and dredgers, but with contracts, concessions, and debt. The real question is this: was the Suez Canal a glorious national achievement, or the most expensive pawnshop slip in imperial history? Because when you strip away the speeches, the flags, and the commemorations, what you're left with is not just a canal. You're left with a balance sheet, a series of deals in which desperate rulers turned a strategic artery into collateral, again and again, to buy time for systems that were already overstretched. Empire thinks in symbols, creditors think in claims. Suez sits where those two worlds collide. To see how this pawn ticket was written, you have to go back to the mid-19th century. On paper, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. In reality, it functioned like a semi-independent state under its own hereditary rulers, the Khedives. Men like Saad Pasha, and later Ismail Pasha, dreamed of dragging Egypt into the ranks of modern nations. Railways, factories, palaces, opera houses, European advisors, and above all, a canal that would put Egypt at the center of world trade. Into this dream walked Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat with a grand vision and excellent friends in Paris. He sold the Quai de Vol court an irresistible idea: cut a canal through the Isthmus of Suez, shorten the route from Europe to India, and Asia by thousands of kilometers, and turn Egypt into the toll booth of global commerce. The project would be funded and run by a private company backed by European capital and know-how. Egypt would provide the land. The future would provide the profits. The key word is company. In 1854 and 1856, Saad granted de Lesseps concessions that created the Suez Canal Company and gave it the right to build and operate the canal for 99 years after completion. 99 years is not a construction timetable, it's a claim on the future. The terms were generous, to put it politely. The company received the right to carve a zone across Egypt, to extract materials, to build not only the canal itself but also related infrastructure, and to enjoy tax privileges and legal protections. Egypt promised land. It also promised labor. In practice, that meant tens of thousands of Egyptians conscripted under a corvée system to dig, blast, and haul under brutal conditions. The celebrated ditch in the desert was cut by hands that had very little say in the deal that created it. On paper, Egypt remained sovereign. The canal ran through its territory. The Khedive's signature sat on the concession. In practice, a foreign-dominated company had acquired a semi-autonomous strip, shielded by international backing, and designed to funnel tolls not primarily into Egyptian coffers, but into the pockets of shareholders and creditors abroad. That's what a pawn ticket looks like at the beginning. You still own the object. It sits in your house. You can point to it and call it yours. But the paperwork says that when the cash starts flowing, someone else is first in line. The canal opened in 1869 with fireworks, banquets, visiting royalty, European orchestras, and endless praise for modern progress. Empresses and princes sailed through the new waterway. The newspapers called it a miracle of civilization. Egypt's ruler, Ismail, liked to say, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe." It sounded like triumph. The numbers told another story. The canal cost far more than expected. Ismail's wider modernization program, palaces, railways, celebrations, had been financed heavily with foreign loans. Revenues lagged behind promises. By the early 1870s, Egypt's state finances were drowning in debt. Payments to European bondholders devoured a huge share of income. Default loomed. This is where the pawnshop door swings open. Facing a fiscal collapse, Ismail made a desperate move. The Egyptian state owned around 44% of the Suez Canal Company's shares. Those shares were extremely valuable. They represented a claim on future tolls, the very cash that would flow through the world's new maritime shortcut. In a calm scenario, they could have been a long-term foundation for national wealth. In a crisis, they became something else, collateral. In 1875, the British government, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, quietly stepped in. With money borrowed from the Rothschild banking family, London rushed to buy Egypt's entire shareholding in the Suez Canal Company. No drawn-out parliamentary debate, no protracted public negotiation. A quick private loan, a swift purchase, and suddenly a foreign government, not Egypt, was sitting on nearly half the company. For Egypt, the sale brought in desperately needed cash to plug the immediate hole. For Britain, it was an extraordinary bargain. For the price of a few £1,000,000, it gained effective control over the Canal Company's policy and secured a strategic grip over the route to India and the East. This is the heart of the pawn ticket metaphor. The borrower hands over something with long-term strategic and economic value in exchange for short-term relief. The piece of paper that records that transaction lives in someone else's safe. The pawned family heirloom now sits in the window of an Imperial jeweler, but selling the Canal shares didn't erase Egypt's wider debt. The country still owed staggering sums to foreign creditors, and those creditors were not shy about protecting their interests. In the late 1870s, European powers established international financial control over Egypt's finances. Commissions, staffed by British and French representatives, supervised the budget. Key revenue streams were earmarked for debt service. The formal language was technocratic. The reality was that sovereign decisions in Cairo now required a nod from accountants in London and Paris. When polite oversight failed to calm local resentment, harder power followed. In 1882, amid nationalist unrest and an army revolt, British forces invaded and occupied Egypt, officially to restore order and protect foreign lives. Unofficially, they were there to protect two things above all: the canal and the steady payment of debts. British troops would remain in Egypt, in one form or another, for decades. You can see the pattern clearly now: a modernization drive financed by foreign loans, a crisis, a sale of strategic assets, external control over finances, military occupation justified by the need to secure an international asset. The canal had begun as a dream of national transformation. It ended up as collateral for an empire that measured power in shipping routes and interest payments. Even when the legal framework changed, the underlying logic stayed the same. In 1888, the Constantinople Convention declared the Suez Canal an international waterway, open to all flags in peace and war. It enshrined free navigation in treaty form. Yet the country whose soil the canal cut through had barely any real voice in enforcing that neutrality. British soldiers still guarded the banks. British officials still held decisive sway over how the canal was used. This is how empire dresses up a pawn ticket as a principle: sovereignty on paper, control in practice. For Britain, Suez became a lifeline. It shortened the route to India, underpinned commercial routes to Asia, and served as a key artery in both world wars. The Royal Navy thought in terms of choke points. Suez was one of the fingers around the world's throat. As long as Britain commanded that finger, it believed, it could still pretend to be a global power, even as its financial position weakened and its debts mounted after 1945. But a pawn ticket has two sides. On the other side of the counter, a new generation in Egypt was drawing very different conclusions. By the mid-20th century, Egypt was formally independent, but British troops still occupied the canal zone. The Suez Canal Company remained a wealthy, foreign-dominated entity operating on Egyptian land. For young officers like Gamal Abdel Nasser, this wasn't a neutral company. It was a symbol, a daily reminder that the country's most valuable artery was still under foreign control. Nasser wanted to remake Egypt as a modern, sovereign republic. Central to that vision was the Aswan High Dam, a colossal project on the Nile meant to generate electricity, control floods, and irrigate agriculture. To build it, he needed capital. For a time, the United States and Britain offered to help finance the dam. Then the offer was pulled. Cold War politics, arms deals with the Eastern Bloc, and suspicions in Washington all played their part. Once again, an Egyptian leader found himself holding a strategic asset and facing a financial wall. The difference this time was that Nasser was not looking for a new pawn ticket. He wanted to redeem an old one. On a hot July day in 1956, in a speech in Alexandria watched and listened to across the country, Nasser announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. The company's assets would be seized. Its revenues would go to the Egyptian state. The tolls paid by ships would help fund the Aswan Dam. On the surface, it was a legal act, the state buying out a concession before its scheduled expiration with compensation to shareholders. In political reality, it was a thunderclap. For Egyptians, it was a declaration that the canal dug by their labor would finally be used for their own development. For Britain and France, it was an intolerable act by a former colonial subject. They saw not a sovereign state exercising its rights, but a debtor refusing to honor an old pawn ticket. The response was swift and conspiratorial. Britain, France, and Israel coordinated a secret plan. Israel would invade Sinai. Britain and France would then present themselves as neutral powers intervening to separate the combatants and protect the canal, seizing key positions along its length. The operation began well on the ground. Militarily, they achieved rapid success. Politically, they had misread the clock. The world had changed. The United States, now the dominant Western power and a creditor to all three, was furious at being bypassed. The Soviet Union thundered against colonial aggression. Global markets began punishing sterling. Under intense pressure, diplomatic and financial, London and Paris were forced into a humiliating withdrawal. For Britain, Suez in 1956 marked the moment it realized that the empire's pawn tickets were no longer cashable. The canal was still there. The ships still passed. But the ability to enforce a 19th century claim with 19th century methods had evaporated. And yet, even with the Union Jack lowered and the Suez Canal Company dissolved into an Egyptian authority, the deeper story did not end. The canal remained what it had always been, a stream of future cash flows and a strategic choke point. Whoever depended on that revenue was, in some form, still holding or negotiating over a pawn ticket. In the modern era, that dependence takes different shapes. The canal's tolls are a critical source of foreign currency for Egypt. When traffic flows smoothly, the canal generates billions in revenue. When shipping is disrupted by wars in the region, attacks in nearby seas, or even a single ship wedged diagonally across the waterway, the economic shock ripples through Egypt's budget and balance of payments. Each disruption drives the state back to the same menu of options. New loans, new deals, new promises backed, directly or indirectly, by the value of strategic assets. Look closely at the language used around today's infrastructure negotiations. Unlocking value, monetizing assets, public-private partnerships, long-term concessions. In theory, it's all about efficiency and investment. In practice, it often means slicing up future revenue streams and offering them to creditors and investors in exchange for short-term cash and temporary stability. The pattern that began with Ferdinand de Lesseps and Khedive Saad has not disappeared. It has become more sophisticated. A state wants prestige, development, and growth. It announces a big project, a canal, a dam, a port, a special economic zone. It cannot fund the project entirely from its own savings, so it borrows heavily abroad and brings in foreign contractors and capital. The returns take time to materialize, the costs rise faster than expected, and the broader economy struggles. Debt piles up. At the first serious shock, the state faces a choice: default and lose access to credit, or sell stakes in the very assets that were supposed to guarantee its independence. In that moment, the speeches mention reform and rationalization. The contracts mention revenue pledges, arbitration clauses, and long-time horizons. Somewhere, a quiet hand signs away another pawn ticket. Suez is not unique. It is a template. Ports leased for decades to foreign operators in exchange for upfront cash. Rail corridors built with external loans, with land rights and future freight revenues pledged as security. Energy grids and pipelines privatized under pressure from creditors. Even digital infrastructure, undersea cables, data centers, satellite rights, can become the modern equivalent of a canal concession. The details differ, the language shifts, but the core logic remains. Strategic infrastructure is rarely just infrastructure. It is collateral in a world where power is expressed, not only through armies and fleets, but through balance sheets and legal contracts. The Suez Canal story, from the first concession in the 1850s to the nationalization in the 1950s and the debt negotiations of the 21st century, can be read as a long argument over who holds the claim ticket to a single line of water in the desert. France held it for a while. Britain took it next. Egypt seized it back. International institutions and creditors lean on it today. Empires rise and fall. Governments change. Flags are hoisted and lowered. The pawn ticket just keeps getting rewritten. So what is the real lesson of the Suez Canal deal? It is not simply that foreign powers exploited a weaker state. That is obvious. The deeper lesson is that states often cooperate in their own subordination, not out of stupidity, but out of desperation. They sign away future control to solve present crises. They trade long-term sovereignty for short-term solvency. They convince themselves they can always buy the asset back later, when they are stronger. History's answer is cruel. Later almost never arrives in the form they imagine. The Khedive, who thought he was buying modernity, woke up to find budget inspectors in his ministries and foreign troops on his soil. The Imperial cabinet that thought a share certificate would preserve global power discovered that it was now dependent on the goodwill of another superpower and the mood of financial markets. The nationalist who tore up the old pawn ticket discovered that independence purchased in one arena could be eroded by new dependencies in another. A canal doesn't have opinions. It doesn't care who owns it, who guards it, who profits from it. Water flows downhill. Ships follow the shortest route. Money follows the toll booth. Power follows the claim. The only meaningful question is this: who holds that claim and on what terms? When you hear about a historic infrastructure deal, a strategic partnership, or a transformative corridor, imagine you're standing in a pawn shop, not at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Look past the shiny object in the window, the canal, the port, the dam, and focus on the little slip of paper behind the counter. Whose name is on it? How long does it last? What happens if the borrower cannot pay? The Suez Canal deal, stripped of romance, is the story of an empire and a state negotiating over that slip of paper for more than a century. It is a reminder that, in the end, sovereignty is not just about flags and speeches. It is about who has the right, when the crisis hits, to walk in, point to a vital artery of the world economy and say, that is mine, and here is the ticket to prove it. History has already shown us what happens when you wait too long to read the fine print.